Eleanor Vance believed in the power of invisibility. It was a cloak she had woven for herself over many years, thread by thread, with quiet steps and lowered eyes. In a world of glittering jewels and loud opinions, she was the muted gray silk lining of the court, present but never truly seen. Tonight in the Sunstone Hall, her cloak was serving her well. 1,000 candles dripped wax onto ornate silver candelabras, their light dancing across the polished marble floor. The air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume, beeswax, and the faint, sweet smell of wine. She stood near a marble pillar, cool against her back, a silent observer of the spectacle. Her gaze was fixed on her younger sister, Leah. Leah was a sunbeam captured in human form, with bright laughter and hair the color of spun gold. Tonight she wore a gown of pale blue, a gift that had cost their family more than they could truly afford. Seeing Leah smile as she was spun around by a young, earnest baron was worth every pinched coin. Leah's health had always been fragile, a delicate bloom that could wilt at the slightest chill. These nights out were rare, precious things, and Nora's role was simple. She was the anchor, the watcher, the one who made sure Leah did not overexert herself, that she had a cup of water, that her shawl was nearby if the night air grew too cold. Nora's own gown was the color of a dove's wing, a simple cut that drew no attention. Her brown hair was pulled back in a neat, functional twist. She held a small, embroidered reticule, its drawstrings looped loosely around her wrist. Inside was a handkerchief, a small vial of Leah's calming tonic, and a few stray coins. She was a shadow, and she was content with that. Shadows heard things. They saw the truth in the flicker of an eye, the tightening of a jaw. They understood the currents that flowed beneath the placid surface of courtly life. From her vantage point, she saw it all. She saw Lady Annalise pretending not to notice her husband flirting with a lady-in-waiting. She saw two merchants arguing in hushed, angry tones over a shipping contract, their smiles wide and false whenever someone looked their way. And she saw the king. King Alaric Thorne was not a man who could ever be invisible. He was the center of gravity in any room he entered. Tall and powerfully built, he moved with a predator's grace that seemed contained only by the thinnest veneer of royal decorum. His dark hair was a little unruly, as if it resisted the very idea of being tamed, and his eyes were a startling, intense amber. A faint scar cut through his left eyebrow, a small imperfection that only made his presence more commanding. He wore the Thorne signet ring, a heavy band of gold with a snarling wolf's head, the symbol of his line. He was not dancing, he seldom did. Instead, he moved through the clusters of nobles, his expression serious, a word here, a nod there. Nora had watched him for years since his coronation. She saw the loneliness in him, the isolation of a man born to a power he had not chosen. He was the alpha, the protector of the kingdom, and the weight of that duty was etched into the lines around his eyes. She felt a strange, quiet pang of empathy for him, this man who had everything and yet seemed to be carrying the world on his shoulders. As he turned from a conversation with an elderly duke, his gaze swept the room. For a single, breathless second, his amber eyes met her gray ones across the crowded hall. There was no recognition, just a fleeting, unreadable assessment. It was like being seen by a hawk on the wing. Nora's heart gave a sudden, sharp thump against her ribs. She immediately looked down at the floor, her cheeks warming. It was a foolish reaction. He was the king. He was not looking at her. Not really. She was just a part of the scenery, a face in the crowd. She forced her attention back to Leah, who was now fanning herself and laughing with a group of girls her age. She looked happy. She looked healthy. That was all that mattered. Nora allowed herself a small, private smile. This was enough. This quiet, vicarious joy was her place. A new song began, a lively waltz that sent couples swirling across the floor in a kaleidoscope of color. Nora watched them, a detached part of her mind identifying the different noble houses by their chosen colors. The evergreens in their deep forest hues, the Ashfords in silver and gold, and Lord Valerius Croft, impeccable as always, in stark black and white. He stood near the dais where the king's throne sat empty, observing the festivities with an air of faint amusement. He was a handsome man with sharp, aristocratic features and silvering hair at his temples, but his smile was a cold, precise thing. Nora had never trusted that smile. It was a mask, and she could only guess what lay beneath it. The king had moved closer, now speaking with Lord Valerius and a few members of his council. He gestured with one hand, making a point, his voice a low rumble she couldn't hear over the music. Then, she saw it, a flicker, a tiny, almost imperceptible break in his posture. He paused mid-sentence, his hand moving to his chest as if to smooth the fabric of his dark tunic. His expression tightened for a fraction of a second. No one else seemed to notice. Lord Valerius was still smiling his thin smile. The other lords were nodding. But Nora saw it. She was a student of small things, of subtle shifts. Her life with Leah had taught her to recognize the first signs of distress, the slight pallor, the faint sheen of sweat, the barely noticeable tremor in a hand. The king's face was a little pale under the candlelight. He took a slow, deliberate breath and continued his conversation. His voice steady once more, but he kept his hand on his chest. Nora's own heart began to beat a little faster, a low hum of anxiety starting in her stomach. It was probably nothing. The hall was warm, stuffy. He had been standing for hours, entertaining fools and flatterers. Anyone would feel a moment of fatigue. She told herself to look away, to focus on Leah, but her eyes kept drifting back to the king. He excused himself from the group, turning to get a drink from a servant holding a tray of goblets. As he reached for one, his hand wavered. He stumbled, just one step, catching himself against the edge of the dais. This time, a few people nearby noticed. A lady gasped. A courtier took a half step forward, his face etched with concern. "Your Majesty?" King Alaric waved a hand dismissively. "I am fine," he said, his voice a little strained. "The room is warm." He took a goblet of water and drank it down in 2 long swallows. He set the empty cup back on the tray with a hand that was not entirely steady. His amber eyes seemed unfocused, scanning the crowd without really seeing anyone. Nora felt a knot of dread tighten in her chest. This was more than just fatigue. Something was wrong. Her training, her instinct as a caregiver, screamed at her. His color was poor. His breathing was too controlled, as if he were fighting for every breath. He looked like a man trying to master a sudden, overwhelming wave of pain or dizziness. Her mind raced through the herbs she knew. Feverfew for a headache, willow bark for pain, ginger for nausea, but she was helpless, a nobody standing by a pillar. The music swelled again, a desperate attempt to paper over the crack in the evening's perfection. Most of the dancers, caught up in their own worlds, had missed the incident entirely. But those closer to the throne were now watching the king with worried, sidelong glances. He was trying to maintain his composure, standing straight and tall, but Nora could see the tension in his shoulders, the rigid set of his jaw. He was a fortress under siege from within. Lord Valerius Croft was at his side instantly, his face a perfect mask of solicitous concern. "Alaric, perhaps you should retire for the evening," he said, his voice smooth and clear. "You do not look well." The king shook his head, a stubborn, proud gesture. "It will pass, Valerius. Do not cause a scene." But it was too late. The scene had already been set. All that was needed was a director to call action. As if drawn by an invisible string, Nora took a half step away from her pillar, an unconscious, impulsive move toward the center of the drama. She wanted to help. The thought was absurd. What could she possibly do? But the instinct was overwhelming. In that small, clumsy movement, the silk drawstrings of her reticule slipped from her damp wrist. The little bag fell to the marble floor with a soft, muffled thud. It was nothing, a dropped purse. But in that moment of high tension, it sounded like a drum beat in the sudden quiet. A few heads turned. Nora's face flooded with color as she bent to retrieve it. But Lord Valerius was faster. He moved with a startling quickness, stepping away from the king and swooping down. He did not pick up the bag. Instead, his fingers closed around something small and metallic that had rolled out of it. He stood up slowly, holding it between his thumb and forefinger. It was a small silver vial. It was ornate, decorated with intricate filigree, and it caught the candlelight, glinting like a fallen star. Inside, a violet liquid shimmered, thick and iridescent. It was Leah's calming tonic, a simple infusion of lavender and chamomile. But in the charged atmosphere of the hall, held aloft in Lord Valerius's hand, it looked sinister. It looked magical. What is this? Valerius's voice was not loud, but it cut through the murmurs like a blade. All conversation stopped. The musicians, sensing the shift, let their instruments fall silent one by one. The silence that descended was absolute, heavy, and terrifying. Nora straightened up, her heart a wild bird trapped in her throat. She stared at the vial in his hand, confusion warring with a rising tide of fear. It's, it's my sister's, she stammered, her voice a pathetic whisper. A tonic. Lord Valerius turned his cold blue eyes on her. For the first time in her life, Eleanor Vance was the absolute center of attention. Hundreds of pairs of eyes were fixed on her. She felt stripped bare, her cloak of invisibility torn away and set ablaze. A tonic? Valerius repeated, his voice dripping with theatrical disbelief. He took a step toward the king, who was now leaning heavily against the dais, his eyes closed, his face beaded with sweat. Or perhaps something more potent. He raised his arm, his voice ringing through the cavernous hall. Each word a hammer blow. Guards, stop! Do not let this woman flee! Nora flinched as if struck. Flee? She was frozen to the spot, her feet seemingly fused to the marble. She could feel Leah's terrified gaze on her from across the room. Valerius turned, addressing the stunned crowd, his voice filled with righteous fury. He pointed a damning finger at Nora. We have all seen the king's sudden affliction, his strange behavior, and now we find this. He shook the violet liquid catching the light. This woman, this nobody who skulks in the shadows, has been watching the king all evening. I saw her myself. A collective gasp rippled through the hall. People who had not even known Nora existed were now staring at her with a mixture of horror and morbid fascination. Her simple gray dress now seemed like the garb of a spell. Her quiet demeanor now looked like cunning concealment. This is no simple tonic, Valerius declared, his voice rising to a crescendo. He uncorked the vial and pretended to sniff it, his face twisting in disgust. This is an enchantment, a foul potion meant to cloud the mind and steal the will. He took a dramatic step back from Nora, as if she were venomous. She has tried to bewitch our king, he shouted, his accusation echoing off the high vaulted ceilings. This is the work of dark magic. She has given him a love potion. The words hung in the dead air, obscene and impossible. Love potion. The phrase was a fantasy, a fairy tale trope. But in the face of the king's obvious distress and the discovery of the mysterious vial, it took on a terrifying reality. The court was a place of secrets and superstitions, where whispers of witchcraft were never far from the surface. Nora's mind went completely blank. The sounds of the room faded to a dull roar. The faces of the crowd blurred into a hostile tapestry of suspicion and fear. She saw Captain Marcus Flint of the Royal Guard, his hand already on the hilt of his sword, his stern face grim. She saw her sister, Leah, her face ashen, her hand over her mouth, tears welling in her eyes. And she saw King Alaric, who had pushed himself away from the dais, his amber eyes now wide open and fixed on her. They were filled with a bewildering mix of pain, confusion, and something else. Something she couldn't name. The world had tilted on its axis. One moment she was the invisible sister, the quiet guardian. The next she was a sorceress, a traitor, accused of the most intimate and insidious crime against the crown. Lord Valerius's words echoed in her mind, a death knell for the quiet life she had so carefully built. All eyes in the Sunstone Hall were on her, 1,000 points of light pinning her in place. Eleanor Vance stood frozen in the center of the storm, shattered by a lie, suffocating in the sudden blinding spotlight of terror. The silence that followed the accusation was a living thing. It drank the music, the laughter, the very air from the Sunstone Hall. Eleanor Vance felt it press down on her, a physical weight that made her bones ache. Every eye in the room, hundreds of them, was a pinprick on her skin. She saw them all, the curious, the scornful, the horrified. In that moment, she was no longer the invisible daughter, the quiet shadow flitting along the walls. She was a spectacle, a monster painted in the garish colors of treason. Her gaze darted to her family, standing frozen near a marble pillar. Her mother's hand was pressed to her mouth. her face a mask of disbelief. Her father's expression was hollow, as if the floor had vanished from beneath his feet. And Leah, her sweet, fragile Leah, looked so small, her eyes wide with a terror that mirrored Nora's own. This was it. This was the ruin she had always feared bringing upon them. Lord Valerius Croft held the silver vial aloft, a malevolent priest presenting a cursed sacrament. The violet liquid inside seemed to pulse with the panicked beat of Nora's own heart. He had plucked it from her reticule, the one that had slipped from her numb fingers and fallen to the floor, an item she had never seen before in her life, a lie made solid, glinting under the light of 1,000 candles. The world had shrunk to the space between her, the vial, and the king. King Alaric stood a dozen paces away, his powerful frame swaying slightly. His hand was still pressed to his chest, his brow furrowed not just in pain, but in a deep, unsettling confusion. His amber eyes, usually so sharp and commanding, were clouded. Yet they were fixed on her, not with accusation, but with something else, something she could not name. A sharp, metallic clank cut through the suffocating quiet. Captain Marcus Flint of the Royal Guard stepped forward, his polished silver and black uniform a stark proclamation of duty. His face was a stone carving of grim certainty. He saw the ailing king, he saw the vial, and he saw the accused. For a man like Flint, the equation was simple. Lady Eleanor Vance, his voice was devoid of any emotion, clipped and final. By order of the crown, you are under arrest for the use of illicit enchantments and for high treason against His Majesty, King Alaric. The words were a hammer blow. Arrest. Treason. The whispers that erupted around the hall were like the hissing of snakes. Two guards moved to flank Captain Flint, their hands resting on the hilts of their swords. Their steps were heavy, deliberate, each footfall on the marble floor, a nail being driven into the coffin of her life. Nora's breath hitched. She imagined the cold, damp darkness of the dungeons beneath the palace. The shame, the questions, the inevitable, terrible end. Her family's name would be dragged through the mud, their fortunes seized, their lives destroyed. All because of a lie she could not disprove. She took an involuntary step back, her simple gown catching on her heel. There was nowhere to run. As Flint reached for her arm, a voice cut through the air, low and rough, like stone grinding against stone. Stop. It was one word, but it carried the absolute, unquestionable authority of the king. Every person in the hall froze, including Captain Flint, his hand hovering an inch from Nora's sleeve. All heads turned back to Alaric. He had lowered his hand from his chest and raised it, palm out, a gesture that halted the entire world. His breathing was labored, a muscle twitching in his jaw. The pain was still etched on his face, but now it was mingled with a fierce, protective intensity. His gaze had not left Nora. Inside Alaric's mind, a war was raging. A fire snaked through his veins, hot and unnatural. It was a familiar feeling, the dark prelude to the change. The moon sickness his bloodline carried like a curse. But this was wrong. It was violent, chaotic. The poison, whatever it was tearing at the cage that held his other self in check. Yet through the haze of pain and the rising snarl of the beast within, there was another sensation. A strange, powerful current pulling him toward the woman in the simple brown dress. Eleonora, he had noticed her before, a quiet presence in a loud court. He had admired her gentle care for her sister, her unassuming grace. Now the thought of her being touched, of her being dragged away, sent a spike of pure primal panic through him. It was an instinct deeper than thought, an inexplicable certainty that her presence was the only thing anchoring him, the only thing keeping the fire from consuming him completely. The potion was meant to kill him, but in its arcane chemistry, it had created a bond, a desperate, illusory connection that his very soul screamed to maintain. Your Majesty? Captain Flint's voice was laced with confusion. He was a man of rules, and the rule was to protect the king. The woman before him was the source of the threat. The logic was unshakable. Alaric took a staggering step forward, his eyes never leaving Nora's. The crowd parted before him like water. He could feel their fear, their awe. He could feel Valerius's shock, a flicker of outrage that his perfect plan was unraveling. The king reached Nora, standing so close, She could feel the heat radiating from his body. He was burning up. He looked down at her, his amber eyes swirling with a storm of pain and something that looked terrifyingly like need. He spoke again, his voice clearer now, ringing with a command that would echo through the kingdom for years to come. She will stay by my side. A collective gasp swept the hall. Lord Valerius's mask of concern finally slipped, revealing a flash of pure fury before it was smoothed away. Captain Flint looked as if the king had just commanded him to sprout wings and fly. "But sire," the captain protested, his voice tight, "she is the one who... She has a love potion. She has enchanted you." Alaric's lips twisted into something that was almost a sneer, a flash of the wolf he held within. "If it is an enchantment," he growled, the sound vibrating in Nora's chest, "then it is one we cannot break." He swayed on his feet, and for a terrifying second, Nora thought he would fall. He reached out, not to grab her, but as if to steady himself on the very air between them. His gaze swept over the stunned faces of his court, his guards, his council. Then he delivered the final, impossible decree. "To separate us now," he said, each word a monumental effort, "could kill me." The declaration hung in the air, more shocking than the accusation of treason. It was madness. It was an admission of weakness a king should never make. It defied all logic, all protocol. Nora stared up at him, her terror momentarily eclipsed by sheer, staggering disbelief. He believed it. He truly believed that his life was now tied to hers. The poison, the supposed love potion, had done its work far more effectively and strangely than even its creator could have intended. This wasn't a dungeon. This was a cage of a different sort, a gilded cage forged from a madman's belief, and she was being locked inside it with him. Lord Valerius looked on, his mind racing. This was not how it was supposed to go. The girl was to be arrested, questioned in the dungeons. She would be a convenient scapegoat, her confession extracted, her family ruined. The king would be seen as a victim, his authority enhanced by the swift justice dealt to his attacker. But this was chaos. Alaric was protecting her, binding her to him. The poison was meant to isolate him, to make him appear weak and erratic before it finally killed him. Instead, he had turned his weakness into a shield for the very person accused of causing it. The strength that had held Alaric upright, the sheer force of will he had used to command his court, finally deserted him. A tremor ran through his body. His eyes, fixed on Nora's, lost their focus. The amber light within them dimmed, and they rolled back in his head. His knees buckled. With a ragged groan, he collapsed. He did not fall away from her, but towards her, a titan falling to earth. Nora cried out, her hands flying up instinctively to catch him, an impossible task. His weight was immense, a dead weight of muscle and armor. She stumbled back as he crumpled at her feet, his head landing mere inches from her simple slippers. Chaos erupted. The dam of silence and shock finally broke, and a flood of panicked sound filled the hall. Guards surged forward, shouting for the royal physician. Courtiers scrambled back, women screamed, and men called out in alarm. Captain Flint was the first to reach the king, kneeling beside him, his face a mixture of terror and fury. He barked orders, his voice sharp and clear above the din. "Get him up, to his chambers, now. Physician, with us." Two burly guards heaved the king's unconscious form into their arms. Alaric was a dead weight, his head lolling against one guard's shoulder, the thorn signet ring on his hand glinting in the candlelight. As they began to move, Captain Flint stood and turned to Nora. She was still frozen, staring down at the spot on the marble floor where the king had fallen. Her hands were trembling violently. The warmth from his body lingered on the air. Flint's eyes were cold steel. His suspicion had not vanished. It had merely been complicated by a royal command he could not disobey. He saw her not as a victim, but as a sorceress whose spell had gone horribly wrong, or perhaps horribly right. "You," he bit out the word, his voice low and dangerous. "The king commanded you to stay by his side. You will not be leaving it." He gestured with his head toward the departing guards carrying Alaric. "Follow them." It was not a request. It was an order backed by the threat of cold iron. Nora felt a guard's hand on her elbow, not roughly, but with an unyielding firmness that propelled her forward. She began to walk, a puppet whose strings were being pulled by a mad king and his loyal, hateful captain. The crowd parted for her once more, but this time the stares were different. They were filled with a venomous mix of fear and hatred. She was the witch who had brought their king low, the enchantress who held his life in her hands. She passed her family again. Her father reached a hand out as if to stop her, but a guard blocked his path with a gauntleted arm. Nora met her mother's eyes, and in them she saw a bottomless well of despair. She wanted to scream, to tell them it was a lie, to beg for help, but her throat was sealed with terror. She was marched out of the Sunstone Hall, leaving the whispers and the chaos behind. The grand, echoing corridors of the palace felt colder now, more menacing. Her simple footsteps were swallowed by the sound of the guards' heavy boots on the stone flags. They flanked her on all sides, a moving wall of steel and suspicion. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Every flicker of a torch on the wall seemed to mock her. She was not in chains, but she had never felt less free. She was a prisoner of a royal decree, a captive of a poisoned king's delirium. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of the impossible turn of events. She was not being taken to a dungeon to await trial. She was being taken to the king's private chambers, the heart of the palace, the very center of power. Her fate was no longer in her own hands. It was now inextricably chained to the man who lay unconscious in the arms of his guards, the man she was accused of bewitching, the man who had just saved her life only to condemn her to a far more terrible prison. Her own feet carried her forward, down the long, silent corridor towards the king's wing. She was no longer a suspect destined for a cell, but a captive bound to the throne itself, her fate now shackled to the very man she had been accused of destroying. The long walk to the king's private wing felt like a death march. Nora's modest slippers were silent on the polished marble floors, but the heavy rhythmic tread of the 4 royal guards surrounding her echoed through the empty corridors. Their silver and black uniforms seemed to absorb the light from the sconces, making them look like specters of judgment. Captain Marcus Flint walked just ahead of her, his back a rigid wall of disapproval. He had not spoken a word since they left the Sunstone Hall, but his silence was louder than any accusation. Every line of his body screamed that she was a traitor, a witch who had brought low the most powerful man in the kingdom. Nora kept her eyes fixed on the intricate patterns of the runner beneath her feet. Red and gold threads swirled into stylized wolves and crowns, a constant reminder of where she was and who she was with. If she looked up, she would see the faces of servants, peeking from shadowed doorways with fearful eyes. She could feel their stares like physical things, little needles of curiosity and condemnation. They saw a criminal. They saw the woman who had poisoned their king with a love potion, a creature of dark ambition who had finally been caught. They did not see Eleanor Vance, the quiet daughter of a minor lord, who spent her evenings reading herbology texts to find better ways to soothe her sister's cough. Her hands, balled into fists at her sides, were slick with a cold sweat. Her mind was a chaotic storm of fear. Leah. What would they do to Leah? Her frail, sweet sister who depended on her for everything. And her parents. The shame of this accusation would ruin them. The name Vance would be a curse spoken in whispers for generations. Lord Valerius Croft had done this. He had planted that vial in her reticule. She knew it with a certainty that was as cold and sharp as ice in her veins. But how could she ever prove it? She was invisible, Nora, and he was the king's most trusted advisor. They reached a set of towering oak doors, carved with the royal crest. The guards on duty snapped to attention, their eyes widening slightly as they saw Nora in the center of the escort. Captain Flint gave a curt nod, and one of the guards pushed the massive door open. The scent that rolled out was of beeswax, old leather, and something else. A sharp, almost metallic smell of sickness. Nora's stomach tightened. The king's antechamber was vast and opulent. Dark velvet curtains were drawn against the night, and a fire roared in a hearth large enough to stand in. Animal furs were draped over heavy wooden chairs, and the walls were lined with bookshelves that reached the high vaulted ceiling. But there was no comfort in the warmth. It felt like a cage, gilded and luxurious, but a cage all the same. 2 more guards stood at attention near another door, the one that presumably led to the king's bedroom. Captain Flint finally turned to face her. His eyes were cold and devoid of any pity. He gestured to a smaller, unassuming door set into the right-hand wall. "You will stay in there," he commanded. His voice was clipped and formal, each word a stone dropped into a deep well. 2 guards will be posted outside your door at all times. 2 of 2 will remain here. You will not leave the room for any reason. Your meals will be brought to you." He paused, his gaze hardening. "Do you understand?" Nora could only nod, her throat too tight to form words. She felt like a doll being moved from one box to another. He gestured for one of the guards to open the door. It led to a guest room, comfortably furnished but stark compared to the outer chamber. It had a bed, a small writing desk, and a single tall window covered by a heavy brocade curtain. There was no fire, and the air was chilled. It was a prison cell with a feather mattress. "The king is through there," Flint said, nodding towards the wall that connected her room to the main suite. "His Majesty has decreed that you are to remain close. Should his condition worsen because of this bond you have forced upon him, the royal physicians will need you." The way he said the word bond made it sound like a disease. "Do not think for a moment this is an act of mercy. You are a tool, Lady Eleonora, a necessary component in managing a crisis of your own making." Nora found her voice, though it came out as a ragged whisper. "I made nothing. I am innocent." A flicker of something, perhaps contempt, crossed Flint's face. "Your innocence is a matter for the king to decide, if he recovers." The unspoken threat hung in the air. If he did not recover, her fate would be far worse. He stepped back, and the guard pulled the door shut, the sound of the lock clicking into place echoing in the small room. A moment later, she heard the heavy scrape of a bar being slid across the outside. She was alone. Nora sank onto the edge of the bed, the fine silk of the coverlet cold beneath her trembling fingers. She wrapped her arms around herself, trying to stop the shivering that had taken root deep in her bones. She was trapped, a prisoner in the king's own chambers, tied to him by a lie. Her only hope was the very man who believed she had poisoned him. She stared at the wall separating her from him, listening. She could hear faint sounds from the next room. The murmur of voices, too low to understand. The clink of glass. The soft tread of feet on a thick rug. And then a low groan of pain. The sound went through Nora like a blade. It was a raw, deeply human sound that cut through the royal facade. King Alaric was suffering. And she, a woman who had dedicated her quiet life to easing the suffering of others, was being blamed for causing it. Hours passed. A tray of food was pushed through a small slot at the bottom of the door, but Nora couldn't touch it. Her stomach was a knot of dread. The silence from the next room was more unnerving than the sounds of sickness. She paced the length of her small room, her mind racing. She had to do something. She could not just sit here and wait for a guilty verdict to fall upon her head. She had to speak to him, to make him understand. Her chance came in the deep hours of the night. She heard the shift change of the guards outside her door, the brief exchange of formal words. In the main chamber, the hushed voices of the physicians had faded. There was only the crackle of the fire and the sound of one person's restless breathing. The king. He must be alone. Taking a deep breath that did little to calm her hammering heart, Nora walked to the connecting wall. She pressed her ear against the cool wood, listening. She could hear the rustle of bed sheets, a frustrated sigh. He was awake. Gathering every shred of courage she possessed, she knocked softly on the wall. "Your Majesty?" she called, her voice barely a whisper. "Your Majesty, can you hear me?" There was no response. She knocked again, a little louder this time. "King Alaric? It is Eleanor Vance. I must speak with you." A long silence followed, so profound that she thought he had fallen asleep or was ignoring her. Then a voice answered, rough and strained, "The door is not locked from my side." Hope, fragile and terrifying, fluttered in her chest. She moved to the door that connected their rooms. Her hand trembled as she reached for the ornate brass handle. This was it, her one chance to plead her case, to see the man whose life was now so tangled with hers. She turned the handle and pushed the door open. The king's bedroom was lit only by the flickering glow of the hearth. Shadows danced in the corners, making the large room feel both immense and suffocating. King Alaric was propped up against a mountain of pillows in a massive four-poster bed. The dark velvet canopy above him seemed to press down, adding to the room's oppressive atmosphere. In the dim light, his face was pale, beaded with sweat. His dark hair was a mess against the white linen, and his eyes, usually a sharp and commanding amber, were clouded with fever and pain. He watched her as she stepped hesitantly into the room. His gaze was heavy, unfocused, as if he were looking at her through a thick haze. Nora took a few steps closer, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "Your Majesty," she began, her voice soft. "Thank you for allowing me to speak." He didn't answer. He just kept watching her, his breathing shallow and quick. The air in the room was warm, thick with the scent of feverfew and willow bark, remedies she knew well. The physicians had been trying to manage his symptoms, at least. "I know what you must think of me," she said, her words tumbling out in a rush. "I know what Lord Valerius said, but it is not true. I could never harm anyone, least of all you. That vial, it was not mine. I have never seen it before in my life. Someone put it in my reticule. Please, you must believe me." He blinked slowly as if processing her words was a great effort. A small, humorless smile touched his lips. "Believe you," he rasped, his voice a ghost of its usual commanding tone. "The enchantress begs for belief." He saw her as the part she had been cast in, the sorceress, now trying to weave a different kind of spell with her words. Nora's heart sank. This was not the clear-headed king who had stopped her arrest. This was a man lost in a fog of poison and suspicion. "I am not an enchantress," she insisted, her voice gaining a desperate edge. "I am a student of herbology. I help my sister with her respiratory ailments. That is the extent of my knowledge. I know nothing of love potions or whatever this is." He pushed himself up slightly, a grimace of band tightening his features. "You feel it too, don't you?" he murmured, his gaze drifting over her. "This pull, this cord between us, it burns." He pressed a hand to his chest right over his heart. "It burns right here. How did you do it? What spell creates a chain that feels so real?" She stared at him, bewildered. She did feel something. A strange awareness of him, a hum of energy in the room that seemed centered on him, but she had assumed it was just fear. The intense pressure of the situation. To hear him describe it as a burning chain, a connection he thought she had forged, was terrifying. The potion was not just making him sick. It was twisting his mind, creating a phantom bond, and painting her as the architect. "There is no chain, Your Majesty," she said gently, taking another cautious step closer. "I think the potion, the poison, is making you feel things that are not real. It is affecting your mind." "Poison," he repeated the word, tasting it. His eyes suddenly cleared for a moment, the amber irises sharpening with a flash of the authority she remembered from the throne room. The haze receded, replaced by a raw, lucid agony. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and the confusion was gone. In its place was pure, undiluted accusation. Before she could react, he moved with a speed that defied his illness. His arm shot out and his hand closed around her wrist. His grip was like iron. For a man so sick, his strength was shocking. The heat of his skin was a brand against hers, a sudden, searing contact that sent a jolt straight through her body. It was not a gentle touch. It was the grip of a jailer, an accuser. It was possession. Nora gasped, more from surprise than pain. She tried to pull back, but his hold was absolute. He held her fast, forcing her to stay near the bed, forcing her to meet his gaze. The amber of his eyes seemed to glow in the firelight, burning with a desperate, painful intensity. All the disorientation was gone, boiled away by a moment of terrible clarity. He was looking at her as if she were the single source of all his suffering. The whispers, the fever, the delirium were all forgotten. There was only this man and his pain, and his conviction that she was the cause of it. He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a low, raw growl that vibrated through her arm. It was the voice of a king betrayed, of a man trapped in his own body, and he directed all of it at her. "Wida," he demanded, the single word cutting through the silence of the room. "Why did you do it?" Nora stared into the king's pained amber eyes, and the last of her fragile hope crumbled into dust. The confusion, the fevered ramblings, she could have fought those. But this cold, clear certainty in his gaze, was a wall she could never hope to breach. He wasn't seeing a frightened, innocent woman. He was seeing the face of his enemy. She realized with a chilling finality that he truly believes she is his tormentor. The heavy oak door clicked shut, leaving Nora in a silence that felt louder than the accusations that still echoed in her mind. His pained amber eyes were burned into her memory. King Alaric truly believed she was his tormentor. The realization was a physical weight, pressing down on her chest until her breath came in shallow, useless little sips. She was not in a dungeon, but this gilded room, with its silk-hung walls and plush carpets, was a far more terrifying prison. Here, she was not just an accused criminal. She was a constant, living reminder of the king's affliction, a walking symbol of his weakness. She walked to the window, her bare feet silent on the cool floorboards. Below, the palace gardens were cast in the long, melancholic shadows of late afternoon. Guards patrolled the perimeter, their silver and black uniforms stark against the greenery. They were not just keeping people out, they were keeping her in. Through the thick adjoining wall, she could hear faint, muffled sounds from the king's chambers. A low groan, the clink of glass against a wooden nightstand, the terse, clipped voice of Captain Flint giving an order. Each sound was a torment, a reminder of the man suffering just a few feet away, the man who thought she was the cause. Nora wrapped her arms around herself, a futile attempt to ward off a chill that came from within. How had this happened? One moment she was invisible, a background figure ensuring her sister's comfort. The next, she was the center of a royal catastrophe. Her reticule, the silver vial. She replayed the moment in the Sunstone Hall 100 times. She had stumbled, her small bag slipping from her grasp, and then Lord Valerius Croft was there, his voice slicing through the music, holding the vial aloft like a trophy. He had been so quick, so certain, too certain. A cold knot of dread began to form in her stomach. It was a feeling she knew well, a premonition of danger she'd learned to trust over years of watching over her fragile sister, Leah. This was not a simple misunderstanding. It was a performance, and she had been cast in a role without her consent. Hours passed. A servant girl, her eyes wide with fear and fixed on the floor, brought a tray of food and left without a word. Nora couldn't eat. The bread felt like dust in her mouth. She sat in a high-backed chair, her spine rigid, listening to the king's labored breathing through the wall, listening to the changing of the guard outside her door, waiting for a judgment that felt both inevitable and impossibly unfair. Then came a knock. It was different from the servant's timid tap. It was firm, decisive. She froze. "Enter," she called out, her voice barely a whisper. The door opened to reveal Captain Marcus Flint. His face was a granite mask of disapproval, his posture ramrod straight. But he was not alone. Standing just behind him, framed in the doorway, was Lord Valerius Croft. He was impeccably dressed in a doublet of dark blue velvet, his silvering hair catching the light from the hallway sconces. He offered her a smile that was all courtesy and no warmth. "Lady Eleonora," he said, his voice smooth as polished stone. "I hope I am not intruding." Nora's heart began to beat a frantic, uneven rhythm against her ribs. Why was he here? The man who had accused her, who had set this nightmare in motion. Captain Flint stepped aside, his reluctance clear in every stiff movement. "Lord Valerius has the king's permission to be here," he stated, his tone leaving no room for argument. "He wishes to inquire after His Majesty's condition." Valerius stepped into the room and the space seemed to shrink. He carried an air of effortless authority, his gaze sweeping over the chamber before settling on her. It was a look of polite concern, but underneath it, Nora felt a flicker of something cold and calculating. "Indeed, Captain," Valerius said, turning slightly to address the guard. "As a loyal member of the King's Council, I felt it my duty, and since the lady's fate is so entwined with our sovereign's, I thought it only right to see to her comfort as well." He gestured vaguely toward Nora. "She seems quite distressed. Perhaps a moment alone would be beneficial. A friendly ear away from the constant scrutiny of guardsmen." Flint's jaw tightened. "My orders are to remain with the prisoner at all times." "Prisoner?" Valerius raised a perfectly sculpted eyebrow. "I believe the king's own words were that she was to stay by his side. That makes her his companion, captain, not his prisoner. A fine distinction, but an important one." He smiled again, a predator's smile disguised with courtly manners. "I am sure you can stand guard just outside the door. I will not be long. We would not want to cause the lady any further undue stress, would we?" It could, after all, have an adverse effect on the king. The mention of the king's health was the perfect weapon. Flint's loyalty was absolute, and he could not risk any action that might worsen Alaric's condition. With a curt, frustrated nod, he backed out of the room, pulling the door closed with a quiet but definitive click. They were alone, Bravo. The moment the latch engaged, the atmosphere in the room changed. The mask of civility did not just slip from Valerius's face, it vanished entirely. The polite concern was replaced by an expression of cold, appraising interest. He was no longer a concerned nobleman. He was a master inspecting his tool. "You look terrified, child," he said, his voice losing its silken edge and taking on a sharper, more direct tone. "That is good. Fear is a useful motivator." Nora stood up, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. "What do you want?" "What I want," he began, taking a slow step toward her, "is for you to understand your new position. You are, for the foreseeable future, the king's beloved, the enchantress who has captured his heart with a potent little brew." He gestured toward the walls separating them from Alaric's room. "You are the reason for his fever. You are the source of his pain. You are the cure for his loneliness. You are whatever this court, and more importantly, what he needs you to be." The cold dread in her stomach turned to ice. "I did nothing. You know I did nothing. You put that vial in my bag." Valerius gave a soft, dismissive chuckle. "Proving that would be difficult, don't you think? A forgotten sister against a senior lord of the realm? It is my word against yours, and at this moment, your word is worth very little." He stopped just a few feet from her. His cologne, a sharp scent of sandalwood and something metallic, filled the air. "But we are not here to debate the past. We are here to secure the future." He began to walk around her, circling her like a wolf assessing its prey. Nora stood her ground, her body trembling, but her gaze locked forward, refusing to follow him. "I paid a visit to your family home this afternoon," he said conversationally, "just to offer my condolences for your unfortunate situation." Nora's blood ran cold. "Leah, your mother is a strong woman," he continued, his voice a low murmur behind her. "Resilient, but your sister? Leah, is it? She is such a delicate thing." Nora flinched as if struck. "Her health has always been precarious, I understand. It would be a terrible tragedy if she were to suffer a sudden, unexpected relapse. The shock of her sister being tried for treason, for regicide. I imagine it could be fatal for someone so fragile." The threat hung in the air, unspoken but perfectly, horribly clear. Nora spun around to face him, her eyes wide with a mixture of fury and terror. "You wouldn't." Valerius met her gaze, his own eyes as cold and empty as a winter sky. "Wouldn't I? Eleonora, you must understand, I am a man who appreciates order. The king in his current state is a source of instability. This little charade of yours provides a narrative. It gives the court, the guards, and the king himself a simple, digestible explanation for his illness. An obsessed woman, a love potion gone wrong. It is a story people can understand." And then all the pieces clicked into place with sickening clarity. The vial appearing from nowhere. Valerius's perfectly timed accusation. His ability to manipulate Captain Flint. His knowledge of her family, of Leah's illness. He had not simply found an opportunity. He had created it. He had poisoned the king, and he had chosen her, the invisible girl no one would miss and everyone would suspect, to be his scapegoat. "You did this," she breathed, the words tasting like ash. "You poisoned him." He smiled, a thin, cruel curve of his lips. "The king is unwell, and you, my dear, are the cause. That is the only truth that matters now. Your role is simple. You will play the part of the devoted, if misguided, enchantress. You will stay by his side. You will show concern. You will weep for his pain if necessary. You will allow his every fever, every tremor, every moment of agony to be laid at your feet." "Why?" she asked, her voice shaking. "Why would you do this to him? He is your king." "The king is part of a lineage that has grown weak, distracted by sentiment," Valerius sneered, his contempt a tangible thing. "He needs to be reminded of where the true power in this kingdom lies. He needs to be humbled. This illness will serve that purpose, and you will be the instrument of that lesson. He took another step closer, invading her space, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. Do not for a second think you can defy me. Do not think you can whisper the truth into the king's ear during some fever-induced moment of tenderness. My eyes and ears are everywhere. The moment I hear that you have deviated from your role, the moment you cease to be the lovelorn girl with the potion, a message will be sent to your family home, and your sister's delicate health will fail. Do you understand me? Tears welled in Nora's eyes, hot and sharp. They were tears not of sadness, but of pure, helpless rage. She was trapped. If she told the truth, Leah would pay the price. If she remained silent, she was an accomplice to Valerius's plot. Forced to watch the king suffer, knowing the real poisoner walked free, Alaric would continue to hate her, to see her as the monster who had done this to him, while she protected the very man who held the knife. She could only nod, a single jerky movement. The gesture felt like a betrayal of herself, of the king, of everything she believed in. But the image of Leah, pale and struggling for breath, was branded onto her soul. Valerius had found her one vulnerability and was pressing on it with surgical cruelty. Good, he said, his voice returning to its normal, pleasant tone. He straightened his doublet and smoothed a non-existent wrinkle. The transformation back into the concerned nobleman was instantaneous and chilling. I knew you were an intelligent young woman. You understand the necessity of sacrifice. He walked to the door and paused with his hand on the latch. He looked back at her over his shoulder, and the polite mask was firmly in place once more. He could have been any courtier making a polite departure. I will check in on you again soon, he said, his voice loud enough for the guard outside to hear. Do try to get some rest, Lady Eleanor. The king will need your strength. And then he gave her one last look. It was a smile, but it held no warmth, no humor. It was a look of absolute ownership. It was the chilling, triumphant smile of a puppeteer admiring his marionette. The door opened and closed. Captain Flint's footsteps receded down the hall, escorting the architect of her ruin. Nora stood alone in the center of the room, the silence descending again, but this time it was different. It was not empty. It was filled with the terrifying weight of her new reality. She was a shield for a traitor, a prisoner of a sick king, and the sole guardian of a secret that could destroy her family. She was trapped between the suspicious, pained eyes of the king who believed she wanted to harm him, and the cold, calculating smile of the man who truly wanted him dead. And in that moment, she had never felt more invisible or more horrifically seen. The silence Lord Valerius left behind was heavier than any sound. It coated the air in the king's chambers, thick with unspoken threats and the cloying scent of beeswax. Nora stood frozen in the center of the room, the echo of his chilling smile seared into her mind. Her sister Leah was a pawn. She was a pawn. The king, gasping for breath on the great bed, was the prize. Every beat of her heart was a countdown to a disaster she could not name. Suddenly, a strangled cry tore through the quiet. It was a raw, primal sound of agony that ripped from Alaric's throat. He arched his back on the bed, his body seized by a violent spasm. The silken sheets tangled around his powerful limbs as a tremor shook him from head to foot. The two guards posted inside the room straightened instantly, their hands flying to the hilts of their swords, their eyes darting around for a physical threat. But the enemy was already inside the king. Nora rushed to the bedside, her own fear momentarily forgotten. A wave of heat rolled off Alaric's body, so intense she could feel it from a pace away. His skin, once merely flushed, was now a deep, alarming red. Sweat beaded on his brow and plastered his dark hair to his temples. His amber eyes were wide open but saw nothing. They were glassy, unfocused, staring into some private hell. His breaths came in ragged, painful pants, each one a struggle. Captain Flint, who had been standing sentinel outside the connecting door, strode into the room. His face was a mask of grim concern. He looked at the king, then his gaze, hard as granite, landed on Nora. The accusation was plain. This was her doing. Her magic, her poison, was reaching its terrible crescendo. What is happening? Flint's voice was a low growl, tight with restrained fury. What have you done now? Nothing, Nora whispered, her voice trembling. It's the fever, it's spiking. She knew the signs. She had seen fevers like this before, in the dead of night, sitting by Leah's bedside. Fevers that could steal the mind and then the life. "Do not move," Flint commanded, taking a step closer to the bed, positioning himself between her and the king. He was a wall of black and silver, an immovable object of loyalty and suspicion. His men followed his lead, their expressions hardening. They saw a witch, a would-be assassin, standing over their helpless monarch. But Nora wasn't looking at them. She was looking at Alaric, at the line of his jaw clenched so tight a muscle jumped frantically beneath the skin. She saw the tremor in his hands, the sheer animalistic pain he was enduring. He wasn't a king in that moment. He was just a man, burning from the inside out and utterly alone in his suffering. The calculated cruelty of Valerius crystallized in her mind. He didn't just want Alaric gone, he wanted him to break first. A memory surfaced, sharp and clear. Leah, small and fragile, shivering with a winter chill that had settled deep in her bones. Nora, no older than 12, frantically crushing dried white willow bark with a stone, her hands stained with herbal dust. Her mother had taught her that a fever was a fire that needed to be cooled, not just endured. The thought was a spark in the suffocating darkness of her fear. There was a small service pantry adjoining the king's private dining area. It was meant for late-night meals, for wine and water. But a king who commanded a kingdom built on forests and fields might also command a stock of simple remedies. It was a slim hope, a desperate gamble. Ignoring the captain's order, she turned away from the bed. "Stay where you are," Flint snapped, his voice cracking like a whip. One of the guards moved to block her path, his arm outstretched. Nora stopped, her back to them. Her hands were clenched into fists at her sides. She could feel 3 pairs of hostile eyes on her brow. To them, any move she made was an act of aggression, another layer of her insidious plot. If she tried to explain, they would hear only lies. If she stayed still, she would be forced to watch Alaric be consumed by the fire Valerius had lit. And the thought of her sister's safety, hanging by the thread of Valerius's whim, was a cold dread in her stomach. She had to do something. "My sister," Nora said, her voice quiet but firm, not turning around. "She suffers from a lung weakness. Her fevers can be sudden and severe." She took a breath, forcing the tremor from her voice. "I know how to bring a fever down. Safely." Flint let out a short, incredulous laugh. "You expect me to believe that? You who brought this upon him now wish to play the healer?" "Believe what you want, Captain," and she said, finally turning to face him. Her gray eyes met his without flinching. "But your king is burning alive. Your guards and their swords are useless against this. I might be able to help." For a long moment, Flint just stared at her. He saw the accused enchantress, the source of all this chaos. But perhaps he also saw something else. The stark, undeniable terror of a man watching his commander, his king, dying before his eyes and being powerless to stop it. He was a soldier. He knew how to fight men, how to defend a wall. He did not know how to fight a fire in the blood. "What would you do?" he asked, his voice losing a fraction of its iron certainty. "There might be willow bark in the pantry, and feverfew," she explained. "As a tea. It's a simple remedy, but it can cool the blood and ease the pain. It will not cure him, but it may grant him some peace. It may break the fever before it does permanent harm." Her knowledge was so specific, so practical. It did not sound like the arcane chanting of a sorceress. It sounded like a skill born of necessity. The captain's eyes flickered towards the writhing form on the bed. Alaric let out another low moan, a sound that was almost too broken to be human. Flint's jaw worked for a moment. He was trapped between his duty to protect the king from her and his duty to save the king's life by any means necessary. "Thomas, go with her," Flint commanded one of the guards. "Watch her every move. She touches nothing you do not inspect first. If she so much as looks at a knife, restrain her." The guard named Thomas nodded curtly, his hand never leaving his weapon. He gestured for Nora to proceed, his distrust a palpable force in the air. Nora walked toward the small, arch-doored pantry, acutely aware of the soldier's footsteps shadowing her own. The room was small and meticulously organized. Polished copper pots hung from hooks, and shelves were lined with jars of spices, bags of flour, and canisters of tea leaves. Her heart pounded. It was a long shot. These were the king's private stores, likely filled with exotic luxuries, not common folk remedies. Her fingers scanned the labeled porcelain jars. Cinnamon, cloves, imported black tea from the Southern Isles. Her hope began to dwindle. Then she saw it. Tucked away on a lower shelf behind a bag of coffee beans were two simple, unlabeled cloth bags. She opened the first and a familiar, slightly bitter, earthy scent filled the small space. She recognized it instantly. Dried feverfew flowers. Her fingers trembled as she reached for the second bag. Inside were curled, papery strips of willow bark. Someone in the palace, a cook or a servant, knew the old ways. Or perhaps Alaric himself kept them. A king who ruled a rugged, untamed land would know that nature offered cures as well as curses. This, she said, holding up the two small bags for the guard to see, and a kettle of hot water. The guard, Thomas, peered into the bags suspiciously. He sniffed them, his face wrinkled in distaste. They were just dried plants. He found a small bronze kettle, filled it from a water pitcher, and placed it on a hook over the embers in the main chamber's grand fireplace. He did it all himself, watching Nora as if she might try to enchant the very water molecules. Nora took a clean cup and a silver spoon from a cabinet. With the guard observing her every motion, she measured out the herbs into the cup. Her hands were steady now, her movements sure. This, at least, was familiar territory. This was the quiet, careful work she had done for Leah 100 times. In this one small act, she was not the invisible sister, the accused traitor. She was a healer. When the water was hot, the guard poured it into the cup himself. A fragrant steam immediately rose, carrying the sharp, medicinal scent of the brewing tea. The smell cut through the heavy air of the sick room, a clean and hopeful scent. She let it steep for a few minutes, the water turning a pale amber color, not unlike the king's eyes when they were clear. "It is ready," she said. Carrying the cup and saucer, she walked back to the bed. Thomas followed so closely she could feel his breath on her neck. Captain Flint had not moved. He stood like a statue of judgment, his arms crossed over his chest. Alaric was quieter now, but it was the quiet of exhaustion, not peace. The spasms had passed, leaving him limp against the pillows. His breathing was still shallow, his skin radiating heat. "Your Majesty," Nora said softly, kneeling by the side of the bed. The mattress dipped slightly under her weight. "Your Majesty, can you hear me?" There was no response. His eyes were closed. "You need to drink this," she urged, her voice low and soothing, the same voice she used to coax Leah back from the edge of a nightmare. "It will help with the fever. Just a little." She held the cup near his lips. The steam wafted over his face. He didn't stir. He was lost, adrift on a burning sea. He couldn't hear her. Flint took a step forward. "He will not take it. You have failed." His voice was flat, almost satisfied. Desperation clawed at Nora. She couldn't fail. For Leah, for the man drowning in front of her. She set the cup down on the bedside table and gently, hesitantly, placed her hand on Alaric's shoulder. His skin was scorching, even through the fabric of his linen shirt. "Alaric," she whispered, using his name for the first time. It felt both forbidden and strangely right. "Please, you have to fight this." At the sound of his name, a flicker of something passed behind his closed eyelids. His head moved slightly on the pillow, a restless, searching motion. She took it as a sign. She picked up the cup again. With her free hand, she carefully cupped the back of his neck, lifting his head just enough. His head was incredibly heavy, a dead weight in her hand. The vulnerability of it, the sheer trust it required from an unconscious man, sent a shiver through her. She was holding the king of Eridor as if he were a child. "Just a sip," she murmured, touching the warm rim of the cup to his lips. "For me." She didn't know why she said it. The words just came, a plea from the deepest part of her. His lips parted slightly. Nora tilted the cup with painstaking slowness, letting a small trickle of the warm liquid pass his lips. For a terrifying second, she thought he would choke, but then a faint swallowing motion in his throat. He drank. She gave him another small sip, and then another. He drank weakly, his body responding on some primal level to the offer of relief. She continued until nearly half the cup was gone. Then she gently lowered his head back to the pillow and withdrew her hands. They were trembling. She knelt there watching him, her heart in her throat. The two guards and Captain Flint watched her. The only sounds in the room were the crackle of the fire and Alaric's labored breathing. Minutes stretched into an eternity. Nothing happened. The heat still rolled off him. His brow was still furrowed in pain. A cold despair began to creep into Nora's heart. It hadn't worked. She had overstepped. She had risked everything for nothing. She had just given the captain more proof of her malevolence. But then she saw it. A single bead of sweat rolled down from his temple, distinct from the sheer glaze of fever. Then another, his breathing, which had been so shallow and rapid, began to deepen. It was still rough, but it was fuller, less desperate. The frantic, pained rhythm was slowing into something that resembled sleep. Nora reached out, her fingers hesitating an inch from his forehead before she dared to touch him. His skin was still hot, dangerously so, but the searing, unnatural heat was beginning to recede. It was no longer like touching a furnace. The fever was breaking. A long, shuddering sigh escaped Alaric's lips. The deep lines of pain etched around his mouth and eyes began to soften. The tension flowed out of his body, leaving him pliant and still against the mattress. He turned his head slightly toward her, as if drawn to her presence, even in his unconscious state. Slowly his eyes fluttered open. They were no longer glassy and lost. They were lucid. For a fleeting moment, they were the clear, sharp amber eyes of the king. He looked directly at her, his gaze holding none of the suspicion or fevered confusion from before. There was only exhaustion and a flicker of something else, a dawning, weary, undeniable gratitude. He didn't speak. He didn't have the strength. But his eyes said everything. They saw her, kneeling by his bed, and they did not see a monster. He held her gaze for a few seconds, a silent acknowledgement passing between them in the firelit room. Then his eyelids grew heavy and drifted shut. His breathing evened out completely, falling into the deep, peaceful rhythm of true sleep. Nora stayed kneeling, her hands still frozen in the air where she had almost touched him. She felt the guards' collective, silent astonishment behind her. Even Captain Flint was motionless, his rigid certainty shaken. She had not harmed the king. She had helped him. She had pulled him back from the brink. After a long while, Flint quietly cleared his throat. "Leave him be," he murmured, his voice softer than Nora had ever heard it. He gestured for his men to take up their post by the door again, their stances less aggressive, more watchful. He gave Nora one last, long, unreadable look before retreating to his own position in the antechamber. She was left alone in the quiet, beside the sleeping king. The immediate danger had passed, but her own situation was more complicated than ever. She looked at Alaric's face, smoothed over by sleep. His powerful features softened and vulnerable. He looked younger. He looked like a man who carried the weight of a kingdom on his shoulders, and who had almost been crushed by it. Without thinking, she reached out and pulled the heavy woolen blanket, which had been pushed aside during his struggles, up over his chest. Her fingers brushed against the thick, embroidered crest woven into the fabric. It was the snarling wolf's head of House Thorn, crowned with a circlet, a symbol of power, of ferocity, of a closely guarded lineage. As she touched the rough threads of the crest, a strange and powerful emotion surged through her. It was not fear. It was not anger. It was a fierce, startling wave of protectiveness for the very man she was supposed to be destroying. The heavy wool of the king's blanket was rough beneath her fingertips. Nora had been sitting in the straight-back chair for hours, long after the royal physicians had left with their useless poultices and grave pronouncements. The only sounds in the vast chamber were the soft crackle of the hearth and the slow, even rhythm of King Alaric's breathing. Sleep. True, restful sleep. A small victory she had won for him with a simple tea of willowbark and feverfew. A victory that bought her a few more hours of life, perhaps. Outside the thick oak doors, she knew Captain Flint and his guards stood sentinel. They were not there to protect the king from assassins. They were there to keep her in, and to ensure she did nothing more to harm him. The irony was a bitter pill. She who had just eased his suffering was his accused tormentor. Her gaze drifted from Alaric's sleeping form to the dancing shadows on the tapestries. They depicted great hunts and ancient battles, kings and beasts locked in eternal struggle. Tonight they seemed less like art and more like a warning. Exhaustion pulled at her, a heavy weight on her shoulders, but sleep was a luxury she could not afford. Her mind was a frantic loom, weaving together the threads of her predicament. Lord Valerius's face, his voice a silken threat against her sister Leah's well-being, was a constant, terrifying image. He had orchestrated this entire nightmare, positioning her as the perfect scapegoat, an invisible, overlooked woman with a passing knowledge of herbs. It was cruelly, brilliantly simple. Her only path to protecting Leah was to play the part he had assigned her. The devoted enchantress, bound to the very man she was accused of poisoning. A soft sigh escaped Alaric's lips, pulling her from her thoughts. He shifted, the muscles in his broad back tensing beneath the blankets. His dark hair was damp against his forehead, and in the low light, the sharp lines of his face seemed softer, younger, less a king and more a man trapped in a fever dream. Nora felt a strange, unwelcome pang of sympathy. She remembered the sheer force of his presence in the throne room, the way his amber eyes seemed to see right through the facades of his courtiers. There was a raw power in him, a vitality that felt almost untamed. To see him laid so low, so vulnerable, felt fundamentally wrong. She rose quietly, her joints stiff from sitting. She padded over to the hearth, adding another log to the embers. The wood was birch, and its clean, earthy scent filled the air, a welcome change from the cloying smell of medicinal salves. As the new flames licked at the dry bark, she stayed there, warming her hands, watching his sleeping profiles. He was her captor, the symbol of the power that had her cornered, but he was also her charge. Her survival and his were now hopelessly entangled. This forced intimacy was a torment, a confusing swirl of fear, resentment, and a burgeoning, dangerous sense of responsibility. The quiet deepened as the night wore on. The palace outside grew silent. The moon climbed high, its pale light filtering through the tall, arched windows, casting silver bars across the rich carpets. Nora found herself pacing the length of the room, a caged animal herself. She traced the patterns on the wallpaper with her finger. She ran her hand over the cool, smooth wood of a bookshelf, anything to keep her mind from splintering. She was so terribly alone. Then he began to mutter. At first, it was just a low, incoherent rumble in his chest. Nora froze, her heart leaping into her throat. She crept closer to the bed, straining to hear. Was the fever returning? Had her remedy only been a temporary reprieve? No, not again. The words were slurred, thick with sleep and pain. His head tossed on the pillow, a restless, agitated movement. The cage, it's too weak. Nora leaned in, her brow furrowed. Cage? Was he dreaming of a prison? Perhaps he was reliving a battle, a capture. His past was a mystery to her, a tapestry as grand and unknown as the ones on his walls. He fell silent for a moment, his breathing growing harsh. A sheen of sweat reappeared on his brow. Nora instinctively reached for the cloth and basin of cool water on the bedside table, but she hesitated. Touching him felt like a transgression, a line she shouldn't cross. Yet, watching him suffer felt like a failure. The moon, he whispered, his voice a raw rasp. It pulls the tide in my own blood. The words sent a chill down Nora's spine that had nothing to do with the night air. It wasn't the rambling of a simple fever. The phrases were too poetic, too specific. A cage of flesh, the tide in his blood. She thought back to her herbology books, the chapters on poisons and their effects on the mind. Some toxins could induce powerful hallucinations, vivid, terrifying visions. Perhaps this wolf's shade, as Valerius had called it, was one of them. It was designed to mimic a love potion, to create a false bond. Maybe it also created these waking nightmares as a side effect. He groaned, a low, guttural sound of pure agony that twisted her insides. His hands clenched into fists at his sides, the knuckles white. It claws. Inside. Always claws. Nora's resolve broke. She couldn't just stand there. She dipped the cloth in the water, wrung it out, and gently touched it to his forehead. His skin was blazing hot again. He flinched at her touch but didn't pull away. Instead, he seemed to lean into it, a quiet sigh escaping his lips. For a moment, his restless thrashing ceased. His body went still. She continued to bathe his face and neck, her movements slow and deliberate. The room was so quiet she could hear the frantic beat of her own heart. In this strange shared silence, he felt less like a king and more like a man fighting a terrible, lonely war within himself. The beast. He had muttered it just once, a strangled, broken word. What beast? The beast of illness? The beast of royal duty? Or something else? As she worked, her fingers brushed against the heavy gold ring on his hand. The thorn signet, a snarling wolf's head, crowned. She had seen the crest 100 times on banners and documents. But here, on his hand, in the flickering firelight, it seemed alive. The sculpted metal wolf looked like it was writhing, trying to break free. She pulled her hand back as if burned. She was being foolish. It was just a ring. She was tired, frightened, and her imagination was running away with her. She took a deep breath, trying to ground herself. He was the king. He was ill. She was his prisoner. These were the facts. Everything else was just shadows and fear. She finished her task and returned to her chair, pulling a thick blanket from a nearby chest and wrapping it around her shoulders. She would not sleep. She would watch over him, not just for her own sake or for Leah's, but for his. The thought surfaced, unbidden and startling in its sincerity. She wanted him to be well. She wanted to see him stand tall and strong again, to see those intense amber eyes clear and focused, free from pain. The fire in the hearth had burned low, the room sinking into deeper shades of gray and black. The single log she had added earlier had become a massive, glowing ember. As she watched, a section of it fractured. It collapsed inward with a soft whoosh, sending a brilliant, sudden cascade of sparks up the chimney. For a single blinding second, the room was lit up as if by lightning. The flare of orange light washed over the bed, illuminating Alaric with stark clarity. His head was turned towards her, his eyes were partially open. And in that instantaneous, searing flash of light, Nora saw it. His eyes were not amber, they were gold, a bright, luminous, molten gold that seemed to shine with his own internal fire. It was not a reflection of the flames. It was a light coming from within him, ancient and wild and utterly inhuman. It was the eye of a predator, a wolf's eye blazing in the face of a man. The world seemed to stop. The sound of the fire, the air in her lungs, the beat of her own heart, all of it ceased. There was only that impossible glowing gaze. Then just as quickly as it came, the flare died. The log settled into a dull red glow and the chamber was plunged back into soft darkness. The light in his eyes vanished, leaving only the familiar, deep amber she knew. He blinked slowly, his expression unseeing and lost in delirium, before his eyelids fluttered shut once more. Nora couldn't breathe. Her hand flew to her mouth, stifling a gasp that tore at her throat. She pushed herself up from the chair, her legs trembling so violently she could barely stand. The blanket fell from her shoulders, pooling unnoticed on the floor. It all clicked into place with the force of a physical blow. The raw, primal energy she had always sensed in him. The strange, muttered words of a beast, a cage of flesh. The moon pulling the tide in his blood. The royal crest, the snarling wolf, and the poison. Wolf's shade. It was not a clever name, it was a literal description. A poison designed to harm a wolf. He wasn't just a king, he was something more, something other. She stumbled backward, one step, then another, her gaze locked on the sleeping man in the bed. He looked the same as before. A powerful man, weakened by a terrible illness. But she could not unsee what she had seen. Behind that human face, beneath that skin, something else lived, something wild and ancient, with eyes of gold. Nora backed away from the bed, her back hitting the cold stone of the far wall. The sound of her own heart was a frantic drum against her ribs, loud and terrifying in the silence. She realized, with a certainty that froze the very marrow in her bones, that the king was not entirely human. The air in the king's chambers was a fragile thing, stretched thin between silence and a scream. Nora stood with her back pressed against the cold stone of the far wall, the fabric of her simple gown a useless shield. She could not get the image of King Alaric's eyes out of her head. Not just amber, but a molten, luminous gold that pulsed with the shifting firelight. It was a light that did not belong to a man. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic prisoner demanding escape. She watched him now, his breathing deep and even in sleep, his face calm. But it was a lie. The stillness was a lie. He was not just a king suffering from a strange poison. He was something else entirely. The words he had muttered in his delirium suddenly clicked into a terrifying mosaic. The beast, the cage of flesh, the moon's pull. These were not the ramblings of a fevered mind. They were glimpses of a truth so profound and so dangerous it was kept hidden even within the palace's most secret chambers. Lord Valerius had not chosen a simple poison. He had chosen something targeted, something specific. He knew. Valerius knew what the king was, and he had designed a weapon to attack not the man, but the beast inside him. Nora's mind raced, connecting dots that burned her fingers. The king's incredible strength, even when ill. His primal presence that filled every room. The inexplicable, magnetic pull she felt, which everyone had mistaken for a love potion's enchantment. Perhaps it was not magic at all. Perhaps it was something far more ancient, an instinct she could not name. A profound sense of dread washed over her, colder than the stone at her back. She was trapped, not with a bewitched king, but with a creature from the old tales. And she had been accused of agitating it. Her gaze darted from the sleeping king to the heavy oak door. For a moment, escape seemed possible. She could run, but where? And what of her family? Valerius's threat hung over her like a guillotine. Leah, her sweet, fragile sister, would pay the price for Nora's flight. She was caught, a mouse in a trap with a slumbering lion on one side and a patient snake on the other. Her breath hitched in a silent sob. She squeezed her eyes shut, trying to will the world away just for a second. That second was all it took for the world to come crashing in. The chamber door burst open with a deafening crack, slamming against the interior wall. Captain Marcus Flint stood on the threshold, his face a mask of grim certainty. Two hulking guards flanked him, their hands already resting on the hilts of their swords. Their eyes, hard as steel, were locked on Nora. Flint's gaze swept the room, taking in the sleeping king, the faint scent of willow bark tea, and Nora, cornered and pale against the wall. He saw not a frightened girl, but a cornered sorceress. "That's enough." Flint's voice was clipped, devoid of any warmth. "Your games are over, my lady. I will not stand by while you prepare another one of your concoctions." Nora's eyes widened. "No," she whispered, her voice barely a breath. I was watching him." "Watching and waiting," Flint corrected, taking a step into the room. The guards followed, spreading out to cut off any chance of escape. "I do not know what spell you have cast to make the king protect you, but his judgment is clouded. Mine is not. You are a danger to the crown and to the king himself." He nodded to his men. "Take her. The dungeons will be more suitable for her kind." Panic, sharp and icy, lanced through Nora. The dungeons. The thought of the cold, damp dark, of being locked away from the sun, from her family, sent a tremor through her body. "Please, you don't understand," she pleaded, her voice cracking. The poison is not what you think." But Flint was not listening. He saw her terror as guilt. He saw her pleas as manipulation. The guards moved with brutal efficiency. One grabbed her right arm, his fingers digging into her flesh like iron bands. The other seized her left. They began to pull her away from the wall, their heavy boots scuffing on the stone floor. A small, choked cry of pain and fear escaped Nora's lips, and that was the sound that woke the beast. On the bed, King Alaric's eyes snapped open. They were not amber. They were not even the luminous gold she had seen before. They were blazing suns of pure predatory fury. A sound ripped from his throat, a sound that was not human. It was a deep, guttural roar of absolute rage that vibrated through the very floorboards. It was the sound of possession, of a territory being invaded, of a threat against something cherished. The guards froze instantly, their hands still locked on Nora's arms. Captain Flint, who had turned to watch them escort her out, spun back around, his face paling. Every soldier in the room felt a primal fear they had never known, an instinct screaming at them that they had just made a fatal mistake. Alaric was on his feet in a single fluid motion that defied his weakened state. He did not look like a man rising from a sickbed. He looked like a predator leaping into a fight. "Let her go," he snarled. The words were distorted, wrapped in a low growl that seemed to come from the depths of his chest. His posture was wrong. He was hunched slightly, his powerful shoulders bunched like a great cat's about to spring. The guard on Nora's right, a veteran of a dozen border skirmishes, was the first to react. His training warred with his terror. He drew his sword, its rasp of steel loud in the suddenly silent room. "Your Majesty," he stammered, "she is an enchantress. We are only protecting—" He never finished the sentence. Alaric let out another roar, this one louder, more powerful, shaking the tapestries on the walls. And then the change began. It started with a sound. A sickening symphony of terrible snaps and fractures echoed in the room like a great tree being splintered by lightning. Alaric cried out, but it was a cry of agony and transformation. Not of a man, but of a body being torn apart and remade from the inside out. His broad shoulders seemed to dislocate and then reset, widening impossibly. The fine linen of his shirt strained and then tore with a sound like ripping sailcloth. Nora watched, unable to scream, unable to look away. The guards holding her had gone utterly limp, their grip on her arms slackening as they stared in catatonic horror. She saw Alaric's spine arch backward, lengthening with a series of wet, percussive cracks. His face contorted, his jaw elongating, his teeth sharpening into wicked points. Black fur, thick and coarse, erupted from his skin, covering his arms, his chest, his face swallowing the man she knew. The sound of rich velvet tearing was followed by something deeper, more organic. His body was breaking its human mold. The air grew thick with a wild, musky scent, the scent of pine forest and fresh blood. Shadows cast by the fire danced and writhed around his changing form, making it seem even more monstrous, more impossible. For a terrifying handful of seconds, he was neither man nor beast, but a nightmare of shifting flesh and bone and fur. Then, with a final shuddering groan, it was over. Where King Alaric Thorn had stood, there was now a wolf. It was a creature of immense size and larger than any wolf from the northern forests. Its fur was the color of jet, a living shadow against the flickering firelight. It stood on 4 powerful legs, its head held high, its muscles coiled with lethal power, and its eyes, burning with that same golden light, were fixed on the guards. They were Alaric's eyes, she could see it. Behind the feral power, the intelligence, the man himself, was still there, looking out from a cage of fur and fang. The guard who had drawn his sword let it fall from his nerveless fingers. It clattered to the stone floor with a ringing sound that seemed to echo for an eternity. The other guard simply stared, his mouth hanging open, a thin line of spittle tracing its way down his chin. The great black wolf took a deliberate step forward, and another. It moved with a silent, predatory grace that was mesmerizing and horrifying. It did not look at Nora. Its entire being was focused on the threat. It placed its massive body between her and the soldiers, a living wall of protective fury. A low growl rumbled in its chest, a constant threatening vibration that promised violence. It lifted its black lips, bearing a set of long white fangs that gleamed in the firelight. They were not the fangs of a wolf. They were the fangs of a nightmare. Captain Flint stood frozen, his hand halfway to his own sword, his mind refusing to process what his eyes were seeing. The legends were true. The whispers, the old stories about the Thorn bloodline, were all terrifyingly real. His king, the man he had sworn to protect, was a monster. And that monster was now defending the very woman Flint had come to arrest. The world had turned upside down. Nora finally found her breath, but it came in a ragged, shallow gasp. She was no longer being held. She was free. But she was trapped more securely than ever. The beast in front of her was her protector. The king she had been accused of harming had just revealed his deepest, most dangerous secret to save her. Her fear was a cold knot in her stomach, but tangled within it was a strange, impossible warmth. He had chosen her. The wolf drew in a deep breath, its chest expanding. It then unleashed a sound that was not a roar, not a growl, but a true primal snarl of dominance and warning. It was a sound not meant for human corridors, a declaration of raw power that ripped through the thick stone walls of the king's chambers. It traveled down the hallways, across the courtyards, and into the heart of the palace itself. Distant shouts began to answer it, doors slammed. The ordered quiet of the royal residence shattered into a million pieces of panicked chaos. The guards were frozen in terror, their faces ashen gray in the flickering light. The entire court was thrown into chaos by the king's primal snarl, which echoed through the palace, a promise of the wildness that had just been unleashed. The low growl vibrated through the floorboards, a sound that seemed to pull the air from Nora's lungs. Before her, where the king had stood, was a nightmare of shadow and moonlight. A great black wolf, its shoulders as broad as a carriage, stood poised between her and the stunned guards. Its fur was the color of a starless night, and its eyes burned with the same intense amber she knew so well. They were Alaric's eyes. That impossible fact was her only anchor. Captain Flint and his men were statues, their swords half drawn in a terror so primal it bypassed all training. The scent of rain on dry earth and something wild filled the room. The wolf took a single, deliberate step forward, a living, terrifying shield. Then a shudder racked the creature's powerful frame. A pained whine escaped its throat as the form began to contort. The air thickened with the sound of shifting bones and tearing muscle. The wolf collapsed onto its forelimbs, head bowed as its snout retracted and the dark fur receded. The powerful limbs of the beast shrank back into the pale, strong lines of a man. Alaric knelt on the floor, gasping for air. He was completely bare, his body slick with sweat, trembling from an exhaustion that seemed bone deep. He pushed himself up, leaning on the bedpost for support. His gaze on Captain Flint held all the authority of a king. "Get out," he rasped, his voice a torn version of its usual command. Flint stared, his mouth opening and closing silently. "Your Majesty." "What was that?" he finally choked out. "That," Alaric said, taking a shaky step forward, "was an order. Tell no one what you saw here, not a soul. Speak of this and you will answer to me directly. Do you understand?" The captain swallowed hard, his eyes darting from the naked, trembling king to Nora. He gave a jerky, uncoordinated nod. "Yes, Your Majesty." He motioned frantically to his men, who backed away clumsily, their armor clanking. Flint was the last to leave, pulling the heavy oak door shut behind him. The boom of the closing door left a suffocating silence. It was just the two of them, the captor and the captive, except the roles had been violently reversed. He was the one exposed, his deepest secret laid bare. Nora's heart hammered against her ribs. He was a monster from the stories, but that monster had just saved her. Alaric stumbled back to the bed and sank onto the edge, his head falling into his hands. Without thinking, Nora moved. She picked up the heavy fur throw from the foot of the bed and walked toward him. She gently draped the thick pelt over his trembling shoulders. Her fingers brushed his skin, and a jolt, not of fear but of something strange and warm, passed between them. He finally raised his head, his amber eyes clouded with exhaustion. "You are afraid of me," he stated. It was a quiet, defeated fact. "I was," she admitted softly. "A moment ago I was terrified, but you protected me." A bitter smile touched his lips. "The beast inside saw a threat to you, and it reacted." He pulled the fur tighter. "It is the secret of my bloodline, the curse of the Thorn Kings. We are not entirely human." "A werewolf," she whispered, the word feeling foolish on her tongue. He nodded, not looking at her. "Lycanthrope. My father was one, and his father before him. It is a power and a prison, our greatest weapon and our most guarded secret, a secret you now know." "The potion," Nora said, her mind racing. "The silver vial. It was never a love potion, was it?" Alaric shook his head. "I was a fool, consumed by the fever, by the pull towards you it created. There are poisons that affect only our kind. They attack the bond between man and beast, weakening control. The old texts call it wolf's shade." The name sent a chill down her spine. This was a cruel attack designed to expose him, and she was the perfect scapegoat. "Lord Valerius," she breathed. He knew. Alaric's jaw tightened. "Valerius has always despised my family's nature. He sees our strength as a brutish flaw." He looked at Nora, and for the first time she saw no suspicion, only weary certainty. "He framed you. He used you to deliver his poison." The validation was a strange, hollow relief, but it was followed by a cold wave of dread. "He threatened my family," Nora confessed, her voice trembling. "He told me to play the part, or my sister Leah would suffer. I was trapped." The pain in Alaric's face deepened. "He used your love for your family against us both." He stood, the fur pooling at his feet as he paced. A new energy, born of anger, began to burn in him. The court believes I am bewitched. Valerius is spreading rumors as we speak, painting me as an unstable ruler. He stopped and turned to her. The firelight cast flickering shadows across his desperate face. Eleonora, he said, and the use of her full name was a plea. I cannot fight this alone. My control is fraying. Another uncontrolled transformation in public would destroy the monarchy. He stood before her, not as a king, but as a man asking for help. You have a talent for herbs, he continued, his voice quiet. You have knowledge. I am asking you, not as your king, but as Alaric. Help me. Help me find an antidote. The world outside had descended into chaos. She could almost hear the panicked whispers running through the halls. Her name would be tied to it all. Witch, monster tamer. To agree was to dive deeper into danger, to tie her fate to his. But to refuse was to hand victory to Lord Valerius. She looked into his eyes, into the eyes of both the man and the wolf, and saw the same desperate plea for trust. Her own fear seemed a small, distant thing now. Yes, Nora said, her voice clear and firm. I will help you. The silence in the king's chambers was a living thing. Outside the heavy oak doors, the palace was a hive of frantic whispers and fearful speculation. But inside, a fragile truce held the world at bay. Nora sat in a high-backed chair, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, watching Alaric. He stood by the window, a silhouette against the pale morning light, the exhaustion of his transformation etched into the lines of his back. The pact they had made hours ago felt like a dream, a desperate bargain whispered in the dark. Now, in the stark light of day, she wondered if it would hold. He turned from the window, his amber eyes finding hers. The weariness in them was profound, but the suspicion was gone. In its place was a flicker of something she couldn't name. Resolve, perhaps, or maybe desperation. He walked to a small, iron-bound chest at the foot of his bed and lifted the lid. The hinges creaked in the quiet room. When he turned back, he held a single, ornate iron key. It was old and heavy, its head shaped like a sprig of belladonna. He crossed the room and stopped before her, holding it out. Nora looked at the key, then at his face. She didn't move to take it. Her mind raced with all the reasons this was a trap, a test. But his expression was steady. This is for the royal apothecary, he said, his voice a low rumble. And the library's connected to it. No one will bar your way. You have my authority. Nora slowly raised a trembling hand and took the key. Its cold weight was a shock against her skin, a solid, tangible thing in a world that had become unreal. It was the key to a dungeon for some, a place of healing for others. For her, it was trust. A trust she had done nothing to earn, given by a man who had every reason to despise her. Her fingers closed around it, the metal biting into her palm. You're certain? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. I am certain of very little right now, Eleonora, Alaric admitted, his gaze unwavering. But I am certain of this. The person who did this is still out there. And the answer to who they are and what they've done to me is not in this room. It is in your world, the world of herbs and reagents. He gestured to the key in her hand. Go, find what you need. I will have food and water sent. Captain Flint will post guards, but they are for your protection, not your containment. A few hours later, Nora pushed open the heavy door to the royal apothecary. A wave of familiar scents washed over her, instantly calming the frantic beating of her heart. The air was thick with the aromas of dried lavender, sharp eucalyptus, and the earthy smell of valerian root. Dust motes danced in the shafts of light, pouring through a high, grimy window, illuminating shelves packed with hundreds of glass vials, clay pots, and leather-bound books. It was a place of ordered chaos, of knowledge and potential. For the first time in days, she felt like she could breathe. She set the silver vial, the supposed love potion, on a clean workbench. Under the clearer light, the violet liquid seemed to mock her, its shimmer beautiful and deadly. She ran her fingers over the cool glass, her mind already working. She needed to break it down, to identify its components one by one. She began to move through the apothecary with a purpose she hadn't felt since before the ball. She pulled down texts on toxicology, books on rare floral alkaloids, and charts of mineral-based poisons. Her movements were swift and sure. This was her language. In this room, she was not the invisible sister or the accused enchantress. She was a scholar, a healer. Alaric arrived in the late afternoon, moving with a stiff, pained grace that betrayed the ordeal his body had endured. He didn't speak, simply took a seat on a wooden stool in the corner, out of her way. He just watched. Nora was so absorbed in her work she barely noticed him at first. She was grinding a sample of crystallized residue with a mortar and pestle, her brow furrowed in concentration. She would add a drop of acid, watch the color change, and make a note in a ledger. Then she would cross-reference the result in a massive, ancient tome. The rhythm of her work was hypnotic. The soft scrape of the pestle, the rustle of turning pages, the quiet bubble of a distillation flask over a low flame. Alaric found himself watching her hands. They were pale and slender, but they moved with such confidence. They measured, mixed, and wrote with an unwavering focus. He had only ever seen those hands clasped in her lap or trembling with fear. Here they were instruments of knowledge. He was seeing a part of her no one at court ever had. The quiet observer was, in her own element, a force of nature. As evening bled into night, the only light came from a few strategically placed oil lamps that cast long, dancing shadows. Nora's initial burst of energy had faded into a weary determination. She had isolated 3 ingredients, but the primary agent, the one causing the violent agitation of his nature, remained elusive. Frustration gnawed at her. She pushed a lock of brown hair from her forehead, leaving a smudge of charcoal on her skin. "It feels like searching for a single black stone on a lightless beach," she murmured, more to herself than to him. "My father used to say that patience is the hunter's greatest weapon." Alaric's voice came from the shadows, startling her. She had almost forgotten he was there. She turned on her stool to face him. His face was half in shadow, his amber eyes reflecting the lamplight. "Was your father a hunter?" she asked, grateful for the distraction. A faint, sad smile touched his lips. "He was a king, which is a different kind of hunter. He hunted for loyalty, for truth, often with the same frustrating results you are having now." The smile faded. "He taught me about my condition, how to manage it, how to hide it. He said it was a gift and a curse, a legacy of our bloodline that made us stronger, but it also made us targets." Nora listened, captivated. He was giving her pieces of himself, fragments of a life lived in secret. It must have been a heavy burden for a child. "The weight of a crown is nothing compared to the weight of a secret like that," he confessed. The air between them grew thick with his admission. "I learned early to trust no one completely, to always keep a part of myself locked away. The loneliness of it. That was the hardest part. You build walls to protect the secret, but you end up trapped inside with it." His words resonated deep within her. She knew about walls. She knew about being trapped. "I always felt like I was behind a wall," she said quietly, her gaze dropping to her hands. "But one made of glass. People could see me, but they looked straight through me. I was just there, the quiet one. Nora, Leah's older sister. I learned to be invisible because it was easier than trying to be seen and failing." Alaric leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. The lamplight caught the scar above his eyebrow. "I never looked through you, Eleonora." Her head snapped up. Her heart gave a painful lurch. "At the ball," he continued, his voice soft, "before all this happened, I saw you. You were by the gardens, watching your sister. You weren't looking at the dancing or the jewels. You were just watching her, and you had a small, genuine smile on your face. It was the only real thing in the entire room." Nora stared at him, speechless. He had seen her. In a hall filled with glittering nobles and beautiful ladies, the king had noticed the plain, invisible girl in the corner. He remembered her smile. The thought sent a dizzying warmth through her chest, a feeling so foreign she didn't know what to do with it. She felt a blush creep up her neck, and quickly turned back to her books, her hands suddenly clumsy. I need to review the text on symbiotic alkaloids again," she stammered, hiding her face behind the spine of a large book. They worked in a new kind of silence after that. It was no longer the quiet of strangers, but the comfortable quiet of two people sharing a space, each aware of the other's presence. He would rise occasionally to add a log to the small hearth in the corner or to refill her water glass without a word. She would sometimes glance over and find him reading one of the histories she had discarded, his brow furrowed in thought. The hours wore on. Nora's initial methodical approach devolved into a desperate search. She read until her eyes burned and the words began to swim on the page. The poison was sophisticated, a complex tapestry of components designed not just to harm, but to torture. It preyed on the very essence of what Alaric was, turning his strength against him. The cruelty of it was breathtaking. Whoever had done this didn't just want him gone. They wanted him to suffer. They wanted to tear the beast out of him in the most agonizing way possible. Her head grew heavy. The scent of old paper and dried herbs was a powerful soporific. Her blinks became longer, her focus blurring. She rested her forehead against the cool leather cover of the book in front of her, just for a moment. Her eyelids fluttered shut. The hum of the palace outside faded away, replaced by the soft crackle of the fire and the steady rhythm of Alaric's breathing from across the room. She was safe here. The thought was a surprise, but it was true. In the heart of danger, trapped with the man she had been accused of harming, she felt safer than she had in her entire life. Alaric watched as her breathing deepened and her body finally surrendered to exhaustion. She looked so young, slumped over the ancient tome. The charcoal smudge was still on her skin. A fierce, protective instinct surged through him, sharper and more potent than anything the poison had induced. This feeling was his own. He rose from his stool, his joints aching in protest. The poison still lingered in his system, a low thrum of pain beneath his skin, a constant reminder of the race they were running against time. He moved silently to her side. Her hair had come loose from its simple tie, falling across her cheek. He resisted the overwhelming urge to brush it back. He was a king. He was a beast. And she was the only person who had seen both and not run. Instead, she had offered her help. She was fighting for him. No one had fought for him like this before. They fought for his crown, for his kingdom, but not for him. Not for the man and the wolf who shared one body. The nights were cold in the stone-walled apothecary. Without thinking, he shrugged off his own heavy cloak. It was made of black wool lined with fur, a practical garment that carried the faint scent of the pine forests he loved to ride through and the crisp bite of winter air. He gently, carefully draped it over her shoulders. She stirred slightly in her sleep, a soft sigh escaping her lips as she unconsciously nestled deeper into its warmth. The cloak engulfed her small frame, a dark shield against the cold. He stood there for a long moment, just watching her breathe. The sight did something to the tangled knot of fear and fury in his chest. It loosened it. In this quiet, dusty room surrounded by the evidence of a plot to destroy him, he felt a sliver of peace. He wasn't just a king defending his throne or a beast fighting a poison. He was a man, watching over a woman who was sleeping under his cloak. He returned to his stool in the corner, not to read but simply to keep watch. He would let her rest. He would guard her sleep. Nora woke slowly, drifting up from a deep, dreamless slumber. The first thing she registered was the warmth. A heavy, comforting weight was settled over her shoulders. The second was the scent. It was masculine and clean, a smell of pine needles, cold air, and something else. Something uniquely Alaric. Her eyes fluttered open. She was cocooned in his dark wool cloak. The fur lining was soft against her cheek. She sat up, clutching the fabric, pulling it tighter around herself as if to hold on to the feeling of it. Her gaze lifted, seeking him out across the room. And she found him. He was right where she had last seen him, on the stool in the corner. But he wasn't reading. He was watching her. His head was tilted slightly, and his expression was completely unguarded. All the walls were down. The authority of the king, the wariness of the alpha, the pain of the victim, all of it was stripped away. In his amber eyes, she saw a raw, undisguised tenderness that made the air leave her lungs. It was a look of profound recognition, as if he were seeing not just her, but something in her that answered a long-held question in himself. The world narrowed to the space between them, silent and charged, and in that moment, Nora knew that everything had changed. Nora awoke to the scent of pine, wrapped in Alaric's heavy wool cloak. He was watching her from across the library table, his amber gaze intense and unguarded. The quiet space between them was full of everything they had endured. A small smile touched his lips, and Nora felt a blush rise but refused to look away. Finally, she cleared her throat, the sound loud in the stillness. She turned back to the enormous herbalism guide open before them. For days they had searched for the poison that targeted his unique nature. Her finger traced the vellum, stopping on a delicate, bell-shaped flower. It was an ugly, bruised purple. A detail she had read in an old alchemy text suddenly clicked into place. A catalyst, activated by silver. "Alaric," she whispered, her voice tight. He was beside her in an instant, his shadow falling over the page. "I think this is it." She pointed to the name written beneath the illustration. Nox umbra lupus, wolf's shade. The description was terrifyingly precise. It was a toxin that did not just kill, it agitated the blood of those with the curse, forcing agonizing, uncontrolled transformations until the body finally failed. "It says the core ingredient is the night bell flower," Nora continued. "When distilled with silver, it creates a poison that mimics a blood fever, but it burns hotter." Alaric's jaw was tight, his hand clenched into a fist. He stared at the drawing as if it were a mortal enemy. "Where does it grow, Tiyim?" he asked, his voice a low growl. Nora's heart hammered. She already knew the answer. She took a steadying breath. "It's rare. According to this text, the only place it grows in this kingdom is on the high northern slopes." Silence descended, heavy and dangerous. The high northern slopes, the ancestral lands of House Croft, Lord Valerius's estates. The accusation hung in the air, unspoken but absolute. It was not a theory anymore. It was a certainty, rooted in the very earth Valerius called his own. A cold rage settled in Alaric's eyes. He straightened, turning from the book to pace the length of the table. "He will not get away with this," he vowed, his voice shaking with fury. He stopped and looked at her, his expression shifting. "He underestimated you, Nora." A plan began to form in her mind. "He thinks I am a foolish girl who stumbled into his plot," she said, her voice gaining strength. "He thinks you are growing weaker. We let him think that." She stood, her hands flat on the ancient book. "We cannot accuse him openly. It would be his word against mine and cause chaos. We need to make him expose himself." Alaric nodded slowly, a dark smile playing on his lips. "A trap." "A trap," she confirmed. "We need someone we can trust. Captain Flint." An hour later, Captain Marcus Flint stood before them in the king's study. The suspicion in his eyes was gone, replaced by a deep, grudging respect. Alaric explained the discovery and outlined Nora's plan. They would leak information that Nora was on the verge of creating the antidote, that his time was running out. Flint's gaze shifted to Nora. "He will try to stop you," the captain said, his tone grim. "He will come for you." "That's the point," Nora replied, her voice steady. "When he does, you will be there to witness it." Captain Flint gave a single sharp nod. "My men and I will be ready, Your Majesty." Later that afternoon, Alaric spoke with Flint just outside the main hall, his voice loud enough to be overheard. He praised Lady Eleanor's tireless work, mentioning a cure was mere hours away. As if on cue, Nora hurried past with a basket of pungent herbs. She saw Lady Beatrice, a woman known for her gossip, pause to listen. The bait was set. That night, the royal apothecary was a place of shadows and tension. A cauldron bubbled over a low flame, sending plumes of bitter-smelling steam into the air. It was a simple decoy. Nora stood in the darkest corner, hidden behind a tall shelf of glass vials. The cool surface of a small flask was pressed into her palm. It held a powerful sleeping draught Alaric had given her. Every creak of the old floorboards made her heart leap. She thought of her sister, Leah, safe for now, but always vulnerable. She thought of Valerius's cold smile. Tonight, she would prove him wrong. Her fingers tightened around the vial. She was not an invisible girl anymore. She was the bait. Outside the door, a soft scraping sound echoed in the stone corridor. It was a key turning slowly in the lock. Nora held her breath, her world shrinking to the sound of that approaching footstep. The only sound in the royal apothecary was the soft bubbling of the decoy potion. Hidden behind a tall cabinet, Nora pressed her fingers against the cool wood until they went numb. Her own heartbeat was a frantic drum only she could hear. She had to trust Alaric. She had to trust Captain Flint. The plan was simple, but it relied entirely on the arrogance of a very powerful man. A faint scrape of stone echoed from the far end of the long chamber. The heavy oak door swung inward, and a cloaked figure slipped inside. The man moved with a practiced silence, his dark form a blot of ink on the moonlit floor. He paused, scanning the room. His gaze passed over her hiding spot before settling on the simmering cauldron. A low sigh of satisfaction escaped him. He glided toward the workstation where Nora had arranged a series of vials, the supposed antidote. As he reached for them, he pushed back his hood. Lord Valerius Croft. His sharp features were a mask of smug triumph in the pale light. He meant to shatter the vials and destroy all evidence of her work. Just as his fingertips brushed the cool glass, a voice cut through the silence. "I would not touch those if I were you, Valerius." Valerius froze. From the deep shadows near the furnace, King Alaric stepped into the moonlight. At the same moment, the oak door was barred from the outside. Captain Marcus Flint emerged from the other side of the room, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword. The trap was sprung. Valerius recovered quickly, a mask of concerned surprise slipping back into place. "Your Majesty," he said smoothly, "I heard this woman was delving into dangerous magic again. I came to ensure she was not brewing more poison." Alaric took another step forward, his presence filling the room. "The only poison here, Lord Croft, is the one you brought into this palace." He did not raise his voice. "A poison made from wolf's shade. A rare flower, I am told. It grows almost exclusively on your family's northern estates, does it not?" The blood drained from Valerius's face. The pretense shattered like glass. "So the little mouse found her courage," he sneered, his eyes darting toward Nora's hiding place. "I underestimated her." "She saw the viper in my court," Alaric said, his voice dropping lower. Valerius let out a short, sharp laugh. "Viper? I am the cure, you fool. I sought to cleanse a throne that has been tainted for generations." He straightened, his arrogance fueled by pure hatred. "You and your father, you are nothing more than beasts cloaked in velvet, pretending at humanity." Behind the cabinet, Nora felt a chill. This was not just ambition. It was a deep, fundamental loathing. "You speak of treason," Captain Flint said, his voice rough with contempt. "I speak of necessity," Valerius shot back. "This kingdom deserves a human king, not a creature who is slave to the moon. The poison was a mercy. It would have made the beast consume the man, revealing your true nature to everyone before it ended you. The council would have understood." He looked at Alaric with utter revulsion. "The Thorn lineage is a disease, and I was the physician." Alaric listened, his expression unreadable. "And Eleanor, what was her role in your grand cure?" "The girl?" Valerius scoffed. "She was perfect, anxious, invisible, with a sick sister, a convenient, pathetic tragedy, a footnote in the story of how I saved this kingdom from its monster king." At last, Nora pushed herself away from the cabinet. Her legs were shaking, but she stepped out of the shadows. "You would have let my family be destroyed," she said, her voice soft but clear. Valerius's lip curled. "Your family is insignificant, a small price to pay for a stable throne." "My throne," Alaric said, his voice a low growl, "was never in your reach." He gave a sharp nod to Captain Flint. Flint moved forward, his hand clamping down on Valerius's arm. "Unhand me!" Valerius cried out. "I know who you are," Flint replied grimly. "You are a traitor to the crown." Two more guards entered and seized Valerius's other arm. The fight went out of him. His eyes locked on Alaric one last time. "You think you have won?" he hissed. "You cannot hide what you are forever. The beast will always demand its due." The guards began to pull him away. His last words echoed back as he was dragged down the stone corridor. "A monster on the throne." The sound faded until the only thing left was the heavy bar of a distant door sliding shut. Silence descended. The bubbling of the decoy potion seemed impossibly loud. Nora looked at the floor, replaying Valerius's venomous words. "A monster. A disease. She finally lifted her head to look at Alaric. He had not moved. He stood with his back to her, a silhouette against the moonlight. His shoulders were tense, his hands clenched into tight fists at his sides. He was staring out the window, but she knew he was not seeing the gardens below. The great door of the apothecary closed with a heavy thud. Lord Valerius was gone, his shouts fading into nothing. Nora stood perfectly still, her fingers locked around a cool glass beaker. She was afraid if she let go, her trembling hands would shatter it. The air was thick with burnt sugar, bitter herbs, and the sharp scent of ozone that clung to Alaric. He had not moved from the door, a dark silhouette against the dim light. Slowly he turned to face her. In the flickering candlelight, the last haze of poison was gone from his amber eyes. In its place was a profound exhaustion and a vulnerability that made her own heart ache. He looked at her as if seeing her for the first time, not as a suspect, but simply as Nora. "We are not finished," she heard herself whisper. Alaric's gaze dropped to the workbench, to the real ingredients for the antidote. He gave a single, weary nod. "No," he agreed, his voice rough. "We are not." What followed was a conversation of actions, not words. They moved in a silent, practiced rhythm. Nora took the lead, her anxieties replaced by a focused calm. She ground dried silver thistle, the rhythmic scrape the only sound besides their breathing. She measured 3 drops of purified moon petal essence. Alaric became her steady assistant. He stoked the alembic's fire, his large frame bent to keep the flame low and constant. When she needed crystalline salts from a high shelf, he was there, retrieving the jar before she had to ask. There was no master and servant, no king and subject. At one point, she reached for a heavy book, and his hand covered hers on the leather cover. A warm jolt shot up her arm. It was a touch of quiet connection. Their eyes met, and the world outside ceased to exist. There was only the scent of herbs, the warmth of the fire, and the unspoken promise in his gaze. Hours later, it was complete. A single dose of the antidote sat in a small crystal vial. The culmination of their shared effort rested in that fragile container. Alaric stared at it, his expression unreadable. He lifted his eyes to hers, searching her face. "You are certain?" he asked. Nora held his gaze, her fear dissolving into solid confidence. "I am," she replied. His hesitation vanished. He took the vial, his fingers brushing hers, and drank the entire contents in one motion. He set the empty vial down with a soft click. Then they waited. The silence was absolute. Nora held her breath, her heart pounding. For a terrifying moment, she thought she had failed. Then a violent shudder racked Alaric's body. He braced himself against the table, his knuckles white. A low groan was torn from his throat, a sound of pure agony. Nora took a step forward but stopped herself. This final battle was his to fight alone. She watched the war being waged within him as the antidote purged the last of the poison. Slowly, the trembling subsided. He took a deep, shuddering breath. When he finally opened his eyes, they were clearer than she had ever seen them. "It's gone," he whispered, his voice filled with disbelief. He looked down at his own hands, the rage, the constant pull toward the moon. "It's quiet." He lifted his head and his gaze found hers. "Nora," he said. The way he spoke her name was not as a king, but as a man seeing the sunrise after a long, dark night. 2 days later, Nora stood in the Sunstone Hall. She wore a simple gown of deep sapphire blue that Alaric had sent her. By the king's command, she stood near the foot of the throne, in full view of the entire court. She could feel their stares, but the scorn was gone. Now their expressions were a mix of curiosity and respect. The great gilded doors swung open. King Alaric entered, and a hush fell. He was flanked by Captain Flint, whose stern face held unwavering loyalty when his eyes fell on Nora. Alaric moved with a recovered strength, but he did not ascend to the throne. He stopped on the main floor, his gaze sweeping across the courtiers. "You were all witness to an accusation in this hall," he began, his voice calm but carrying. "You saw a member of a noble house accused of treason. Today you will be witness to the truth." He recounted Valerius Croft's entire plot. He spoke of the ambition and the treachery. As he spoke, guards brought a shackled Lord Valerius into the hall. The man stared at the floor in bitter defeat. Then, Alaric turned his attention fully to Nora. The regal thunder in his voice softened. "The court and I myself owe Lady Eleanor Vance a debt that can never be fully repaid. When I was consumed by fever and madness, she cared for me. She did not enchant me with a potion. She saved my life with her courage and her knowledge." A gasp went through the crowd. Alaric raised a hand for silence. Then he walked away from the throne and closed the distance between them. He stopped directly in front of her, and the magnificent hall seemed to shrink until it contained only the two of them. He reached out and took her hand. His palm was warm, his grip firm and reassuring. "Nora," he said, his voice a low rumble meant only for her, but heard by all. "The poison forced a bond between us. It was a lie. But what I feel for you now is no illusion." His thumb gently stroked the back of her hand. "It is more real than this kingdom, more solid than that throne." He leaned in slightly, his gaze unwavering. "Without you, I would have died. My life was forfeit, and you gave it back to me. I do not want to face another dawn if you are not there to see it with me." He took a breath. "I am not asking as your king. I am asking you as Alaric. Stay with me. Build a new life with me here, by my side." Tears of profound joy welled in Nora's eyes. For her entire life, she had been a shadow. Now, this king was seeing her. He saw all of her, and he did not want to let her go. A warmth bloomed in her chest, so bright it was almost painful. She looked up at the powerful ruler who had made himself vulnerable for her. She found her voice, and it was clear and steady. "Yes," she said. The single word was an oath. It was an answer to a question she never dreamed she would be asked. A slow, breathtaking smile spread across Alaric's face. He lifted her hand, their fingers still laced, and turned with her to face the astonished court. They were no longer looking at the woman they had scorned. They were looking at their future queen.